evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. We're delighted to host our first lecture of the year through the School of Theology and Religious Studies Student Association. Each year we have between 1 and 4 lectures that are sponsored, planned, hosted by the graduate students in the School of Theology and Religious Studies. And this, our first of the year, is sponsored by the students of the Liturgical Studies and Sacramental Theology area. We're thrilled that Father Damaskinos Olkinuora, who is a monk of the monastery of Xenophontos on Mount Athos and a university lecturer at the University of Eastern Finland. We're delighted that he's here with us tonight to share with us some of his research on methodology in Byzantine liturgical studies. The lecture tonight is sponsored by the Graduate Student Association and Stresa, which is our student association. It's being recorded by the Institute for the Study of Eastern Christianity at CUA and will be posted on our YouTube channel. So send it to your friends later to share the wisdom that we've received. We'd also like to thank a few students who have been really instrumental in making this lecture happen. First and foremost, Christina Batt, who is the liaison for lectures with the Graduate Student Association. She's been really helpful in navigating the back channels of the university so that we could make this happen tonight. Esther German was a big help in prepping our reception that we hope you'll all stay for afterwards. And Jessica Rentz was a big help in prepping publication material for the lecture tonight. So without further ado, we're delighted to have Father Damaskinos. Thank you so much, Father, and we're looking forward to hearing from you and your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. The podium is kind of sturdy. I feel bad standing behind it, but I need the microphone, so I'll try to somehow navigate myself here. When I agreed to come to speak, I didn't realize it's Halloween. So I'm very happy you sacrificed your Halloween celebrations to come to listen to the lecture. And today morning there was somebody at the hotel asking me, "What are you dressed up as?" So I got the full experience. But anyway, first of all, thank you for the kind invitation to speak here, even though I am actually partly to be blamed for the invitation to speak here, because another workshop brought me to DC, and I was the organizer of the workshop, so actually this trip was kind of arranged by myself. But we decided to combine this lecture with it. And before starting the talk, I'd like to kind of give a disclaimer that I'm not really a liturgical scholar, but I am, of course, a practitioner of liturgy in my everyday life, because I'm a monk in the Holy Mountain, where we retain the liturgical structures perhaps more faithfully than anywhere else in the world. And my scholarly interests move perhaps around liturgy rather than liturgy itself. And indeed, liturgy is such a multifaceted phenomenon that it would be actually unjustified, I think, to restrict its study to people who call themselves liturgists. And this is by no means criticism towards those who self-identify as liturgists, but more of an explanation for the fact that I do not, because I have not studied liturgics more than 2 courses in a language that for the first 6 months was still incomprehensible to me, so I did not understand anything they told me in the classes. I have never studied liturgical history institutionally. I am not a student of Maxwell Johnson or Johannes von Dulis or Father Robert Taft, or even a student of any of his students, and I have always been very critical of Father Alexander Schmemann, as Father Peter knows very well, considered by some to be the greatest Orthodox liturgical theologian, but not by me. What is usual and completely natural for schools and traditions, both ecclesiastical and non-ecclesiastical, is that one unconsciously accepts some assumptions embedded in that school or tradition without doubting or challenging them. And when an external observer approaches this tradition, he might notice matters that have escaped the eye of those acting inside the tradition. And this is why I chose the topic for this paper, the first version of which I presented the past summer at the biannual conference of the Society of Oriental Liturgy in Thessaloniki, Greece. So this talk is perhaps not a systematic study, but rather a collection of reflections intentionally somewhat provocative, maybe, based on observation of an outsider. My own academic training is in classics and perhaps equally in music, but not musicology. I've never studied musicology either. I especially concentrated on early music, and many of the observations I have done in liturgical studies are actually inspired by my background as a Baroque musician. Early music is a very scholarly approach to practicing music, finding constantly a balance between manuscript data and practical realities of performing music. And this is also something I have always had as a guiding principle in liturgical studies, being a practicing monk of the Holy Mountain, where we aim at being faithful to the liturgical traditions as we receive them from the fathers before us. I always have the practicalities of liturgy on my mind. And I do find this practical approach a valid source also for the historical study of liturgy. If autoethnography is used in other fields of humanities, why not here? We have seen new openings in the field of liturgical history by scholars such as Stig Frøyshoff, a dear friend and a fellow Scandinavian, who definitely thinks outside the box and challenges earlier assumptions, even though his studies are also heavily criticized by some other scholars, as we have seen lately. But at the same time, we have a lot of liturgical scholarship based on outdated understanding of liturgy, especially perhaps in more ecclesiastical educational settings, such as Orthodox seminaries. So I would like to make a plea for a careful reconsideration of our methodology and our approach to liturgy, because it has consequences not only on scholarly discussion, but also ecclesiastical and pastoral life. It is problematic when an outdated understanding of liturgical history has become a part of so-called holy tradition. This is the problem of liturgical archaeology. It changes over time based on both new research and new interpretations, and when this clashes with the established way of celebrating liturgy, controversies arise. So after this disclaimer and this initial warning not to be careless with the methods through which we approach liturgy, I want to proceed to discussing some more general observations I have done in my studies in the recent years. I can also reveal to you that the history of liturgical structures has not been of particular interest to me. I am not a liturgical historian, and I actually do not even consider it to be the most important part of liturgical studies, as some do, but I have mainly concentrated on analyzing the content and meaning of Byzantine hymnography and sermons, especially from the Middle Byzantine period. And it is these two genres that I want to discuss today, because I know them best. Naturally, the performance context is of primary importance with such an analysis, and it has been brought up in more and more recent studies. And this is something that in the Catholic and Protestant worlds has already been done for a long time, however with varying success, and sometimes leading to the suppression of the importance of liturgical texts themselves. On the other hand, in the study of Byzantine liturgy, especially in the Old World, performative approaches seem an exotic innovation even today. So my aim here is to challenge some generally accepted assumptions and describe what kind of implications they have in reconstructing the history of Byzantine liturgy, concentrating mainly on Middle Byzantine hymnography, but also comparing it to another important genre, that of sermons. The main assumption I want to discuss here are the notions of text and performance, words that we often use rather carelessly. First, let us discuss texts. We are not always consistent in understanding what the text is and how this relates to different textual genres, even though liturgists often give primary importance to textual evidence. In literary theory, as many of you might know, there are different definitions for the notion of text, depending on the theorist, and I cannot summarize all of them here. But we could say that a text is any object that transmits a message, a coherent set of signs, considered in terms of the informative message's content, rather than the physical form or the medium. I'm not always sure if liturgical historians actually see texts in this way. Moreover, text is often coupled with authority. The structuralist idea of language links markers, in other words, words, with their stable meanings. So in the structuralist framework, an author can express his authority through creating a text. And in a successfully created text, the author can transmit this universal, unified meaning that is attributed to the person of the author. I will later on return to the way this has affected our understanding of the relationship between liturgical authors and the texts attributed to them. Of course, in the post-structuralist discourse, theorists such as Roland Barthes or Julia Kristeva or Jacques Derrida promoted a pluralism of meanings which depended on the reader. This comes closer to the Byzantine understanding of the perception of texts, as we shall see later, but it is exactly not the Byzantine perception of text, actually. But let us take a step back towards a more structuralist understanding of text, text in the meaning of conveying a fixed meaning. Literary criticism may understand text as some kind of original information content of a particular piece of writing, apart from later alterations, deterioration, commentary, translations, paratexts, etc. And in this spirit of literary criticism, we often want to create so-called critical editions of texts in liturgical studies as a part of our quest after an Urtext, as the Germans say, the original text. I have even been discouraged by some liturgists not to study texts that have not yet been critically edited, since we have no reliable edition of the text available. And this is a quotation of what they told me. If we assume that the critical edition aims at reconstructing the Urtext, or the actual text, instead of the secondary forms, such as translations and paratexts, it is perhaps not often useful for the purposes of liturgical studies, I think. We of course know that hymns and sermons often have a more stable textual tradition than Eucharistic prayers, for example. But this idea of an Urtext should not lead us into hasty conclusions regarding the character of the text or its relation to its author, or even the performance context. Both hymns and sermons are living texts, but living in very different ways. A hymn is in most cases dictated by musical and metrical structures. It is created communally, also through this depository of poetic formulas that the hymnographers use. But the text in reality mainly exists as a performed text. It is gone with the wind, as the film says, and therefore has a temporal character. The manuscript is not the realization of the text in a liturgical context. With this, I of course do not mean that textual studies would be meaningless, but we have to refine our understanding of the relation of the text with its performance. Therefore, if we understand that critical editions aim at finding a reconstructed Urtext of a liturgical hymn, they have little value in the research of the history of liturgy. Similar arguments have been presented by Achim Budde in his study on the anaphora of St. Basil, where his results oppose to Gabriele Winkler's idea of finding the Urtext. Instead of this, Budde sees that each manuscript evidence of the text exists in a certain context for a certain community. In the end, this performed text is the only Urtext for that particular community. Likewise, Nikolai Lipatov-Chicherin has studied the editorial history of patristic sermons and has reminded that the edited version, by this I mean the editorial processes that already took place in the scriptoria, transmitted to us is not always close to the performance of the sermon. So we should not assume that the text of the sermon we read in manuscript is the performed sermon. An assumption that also prevails in liturgical studies that is particularly related to hymns is the notion of a copyist. We often speak about copyists. When we use this term, instead of the word scribe, we imply that the copyist would have had a manuscript or a number of them in his disposal when he was compiling his codex. But I ask, why do we so hastily exclude the possibility of oral transmission of hymns? In other words, the scribe transcribing the hymn from his memory rather than another manuscript source. Being a practicing monk, I can say that I know hundreds of hymns by heart, and in Byzantium the number must have been significantly larger, since I do not know the Psalter by heart, and it was not uncommon for a Byzantine monk. They all knew the Psalter by heart. So stemmatology is perhaps not useful, considering this oral way of transmission when editing hymnography. And I think this can also be seen. We have a lot of hymnography manuscripts where there are hymns with several stanzas, and the order of the stanzas varies between manuscripts. And I think this is the result of documentation of oral practices. They didn't copy it from one manuscript to another, but they remembered the stanzas, but not exactly the order of them, so they put them on paper. A sermon, nevertheless, is a very different text to a genre compared with hymnography. It is not dictated by external forms, such as meter and melody, but also its original performance context might be much more improvised than that of the hymn, even if the author would have prepared some notes before delivering his oration by heart. But even in the case of a sermon, we must be careful when approaching the concept of urtext. Sermons always have an editorial history, as I mentioned, and the urtext, reconstructed with critical additions, might have little to do with the original performance. This is naturally a matter that needs to be examined separately with each preacher or even each sermon. Some sermons do include much stronger internal evidence for being transcriptions of live performance, and some sermons seem to be very strongly edited texts. In any case, we have to be careful with identifying the edited form of the text with the person of the preacher, because we don't have autograph manuscripts. What is also important to bear in mind is the ontology of the composition and performance of the sermon. We often are interested in the audience of sermons or the social, political, didactic aims of the preacher, but we omit the ontological aspects. There is some research on the notion of preaching among the early church fathers, most notably Origen, whose preaching theory included the idea of a spiritual illumination of the faithful being a fundamental factor in their ability to understand the sermon. But there is an ecclesiological dimension of this communication process that also involves the composition of a sermon. We can see a particularly demonstrating example in Gregory Palamas's Sermon 53 on the Feast of the Entrance of the Mother of God into the temple, where he initially exhorts his audience, I quote, "So come forward, divine audience, holy spectators, the choir that sings in harmony with the heavenly spirit, and cooperate with me in the homily, and come together, so that you would not only listen and give your attention, but help me with your sincere prayer, so that also the Logos, the word of the Father, would cooperate with me in my writing, in the honor of his mother. May it not fail completely, but may he rather help me to finish it harmonically for the good of the God-loving audience." So, in other words, the act of creating a sermon was not seen as the creative act of a literary author exclusively, but rather, from an ontological point of view, as a communal act between the preacher and his audience, with God being the true author of the sermon through this liturgical unity through the body of Christ. What does this communal and, from an ontological point of view, divinely inspired view of authorship then give to us in practice? From a purely, I would say, positivist point of view, if one may use such an expression, texts can of course be seen as literary documents, but this simply does not make justice to the Byzantine understanding of authorship. We have to take into consideration the Byzantine's ontological understanding of performance and enunciated word. Indeed, all the modern scholarly discussion of the character of language and texts is interesting and especially useful in tracing our own attitudes towards texts and how much they are influenced by these intellectual debates. But I want to add a few reflections from the Byzantine understanding of words and their enunciation. And I remind that here I speak of the Middle Byzantine period, which is the period that often is despised by many theologians and even liturgists. And it's not a meaningless period, however. It is through Middle Byzantine manuscripts that we have most of the liturgical material preserved for us. So liturgists often give a strong emphasis on the didactic character of liturgical texts, that they indeed see as written documents or the social and cultural mechanisms of creating and transmitting texts, but too often they omit their character not as written documents, but as enunciated words in a broader theological context. This understanding is neither structuralist nor post-structuralist, since the words do not have a fixed meaning. Their meaning depends also on the perceiver, but on the other hand, words are ontologically connected with the reality of logi, and are thus not completely fluid or endlessly open, as the post-structuralists say. In a recent paper on the Middle Byzantine understanding of logos prophorikos, the enunciated word, Vesela Valjavicharska from Maryland, here next to us, makes an important observation on the rhetorical thinking of the Middle Byzantine rhetorician John Sikiliotis. According to Sikiliotis, I quote, "Performed discourse, the material deployment of language, is considered nearly divine." Sikiliotis says, "The soul breathes forth speech like a god, to whom it befits to be a creator of such things." In the course of creating speech, the soul finds its fulfillment. That is, it realizes an ever more vivid movement of creation and vivification. Sikiliotis is by no means alone in this rhetorical commentary, but belongs to a group of several rhetoricians, including, for example, John Doxapatris, and this was basic course material for Middle Byzantine teenagers studying in school. Symbolic activity, including language, was not only restricted to theological language. This gives a deeper dimension to the performativity of speech. It is meant to describe the Godhead and its rational order, but, as Valjavicharska puts it, I quote her, "not in the sense of circumscribing or representing an essence, nor in the restricted sense of a speech act, an utterance that either implies an actionable attitude or commits the speaker to a referenced action, as in John Austin's famous work, How to Do Things with Words, but in a way that is symbolically mimetic. The ultimate goal of human language would be to apply those contingent, material human symbols that point to the divine logi as they properly belong, or to speak of the divine, so to say." End of quote. What this means in practice is that in liturgy, which is speaking the divine par excellence, not speaking of the divine, speaking the divine, we have to see the transmission of text not only as a purely philological, intertextual, nor only as a musically intertextual phenomenon, but in the light of this participatory symbolic relation to the divine realities. We often see the symbolic and participatory relation in the prayers of the Eucharistic liturgy or other sacramental rites, perhaps thanks to the overemphasis on sacramental theology and Martin Luther's condemnation of hymnography as adiaphora. It seems often neglected in the study of hymnography and sermons. They are also sacramentally participatory words, hymns and sermons. And if this is the way the Byzantines thought, especially in the Middle Byzantine era, when the main bulk of Byzantine hymnography, for example, was written, it has surely affected the way texts were created, transmitted, and used in liturgical performance, and this should not be neglected. I have been mentioning the word performance several times, but a few more definitions of the term are still necessary because there is much disagreement among liturgical scholars regarding its use. At a conference of liturgical studies, one conference participant, a very respected liturgical scholar, came to me rather upset and said that liturgy is not performance but prayer. This scholar might be among us today. I'm not mentioning any names. I was not fooled by him anyway, and I never was, due to the simple reason that since my teenage years, I had seen how choirs did special rehearsals before great feasts. The altar boys practiced their movements and positions before the bishop's arrival, etc. What is this if not performance? So, performance, as we know from the works of performance theorists, is not merely the technical way of proclaiming a liturgical text in a musical or non-musical way in the church space, but the term performance carries several meanings. Even the very practical level of performance has not been dealt with in enough detail in liturgical studies, at least in the Byzantine liturgical world. When we think of hymnography, it is problematic that still today many scholars deal with hymns purely as texts that are transmitted in manuscripts, as if they were like any other text. Many hymnography scholars have no deep understanding of the Byzantine musical practices and theories, unfortunately, which is shown by the fact that the gap between musicology and liturgical studies is still very deep, and music remains a marginal topic. If it was not for Alexander Lingas, a Canadian Greek musicologist and practitioner of Byzantine chant and the conductor of Capella Romana, most Western liturgical scholars today would not know much about Byzantine music, to be honest. So thank you, Alexander, for doing this work. At least a rudimentary understanding of the Byzantine musical system is essential because it affects the way the text is perceived in its liturgical context. The idiomela, independent melodies, have more weight as performed compositions than the contrafacta, which are texts that are sung according to the melody of another song. But on the other hand, contrafacta create networks of musical textual cross-references between feasts and theological themes. Also, as I showed in my doctoral thesis and has been shown by other studies, such as those by Maria Alexandru, musical compositions are often tightly related with the rhetorical structures and theological hermeneutics of hymnographic texts. Likewise, there are many performative aspects of Byzantine preaching that have been almost completely neglected until the very recent years, such as the use of gestures in preaching. We know that Byzantine rhetoric, being a descendant of the rhetorical schools of antiquity, gave much weight on the use of gestures in rhetorical performance. Of course, the study of such aspects of preaching are difficult to be reached, but some things can be deducted from the internal evidence of sermons and from pictorial sources, both studied in conjunction with Byzantine rhetorical sources. But performance is also something much more than singing and doing gestures when you preach. It refers to the completion of an action, and the definitions of performance theorists include almost any everyday communication in the world of performance. According to Richard Schechner, performance is characterized by the special orderings of time, the particular value attached to objects, the material non-productivity of the performance, and a set of rules. Additionally, all these performances also happen in a certain space that affects the functions of the performance. Perhaps another notion that we should bear in mind when thinking about liturgy is that of aesthetic communication. As Ronald Pellias describes, aesthetic communication, I quote him, is a culturally specified act in which a speaker structures language in a unified and expressive manner, triggering audience response. Aesthetic communication calls upon speakers and listeners to become engaged in the power of art, to accept their respective roles, and to possess the necessary competencies for the exchange to take place. When the participants meet these conditions, an aesthetic transaction occurs, end of quote. This comment is a rather accurate description of the aesthetic dimension of liturgical texts. All these examinations are of course useful when we examine liturgy as any performance or ritual, because of course this aesthetic communication takes place in this aesthetic space in an aesthetic language agreed upon by the performers and the audience. But this is not enough either. One of the lacks in Byzantine liturgical scholarship has been the lack of the study of the notion of performance in the way the Byzantines understood it, which also has resulted in a lack of understanding the lived religion of Byzantium. Often one sees that the understanding of performance in history becomes biased because of the theological tendencies of our times. Eucharistic ecclesiology, which is actually much criticized by many dogmatic theologians in our days, but still favored by many liturgical scholars, especially those with pastoral concerns, gives a strong emphasis on the participation of the laity in celebrating the liturgy. And this can also be seen in the way we approach historical ways of celebrating the liturgy. Communal participation is seen as somehow more valuable and authentic than the group of elite performers. and the partly irrational preference for archaism rather than later phases of the liturgy guides liturgical scholars to see communal participation in the earlier phases of the liturgy. The reality of liturgical performances is that what it wants to reproduce does not fundamentally change through time, despite changes in liturgical texts and rubrics. Liturgy is not only diachronic, but it's also synchronic. The faithful want to link themselves to a tradition, but they are primarily interested in what it means for my life. Since nobody had done a comprehensive study of the Byzantine understanding of performance, I published a series of papers on Byzantine liturgical sources, including liturgical commentaries, liturgical typica, rubrics, monastic foundation documents, hymnography, and sermons. Perhaps I will still continue this series, but I can already say that we have much to learn from the Byzantine understanding of performance in its different forms and contexts. A rather telling example is the foundation document of the Convent of Steadfast Hope, dating from the 14th century, that describes the performative role of different hierarchical levels of the nuns in the convent. The choir sisters, consisting of literate women, have the task of performing to God, standing in front of the heavenly King without distraction and without caring about their physical pains. It is clear that the audience is twofold, both God and the other sisters. The choir sisters are supposed to comfort the other sisters who await this comfort. They are also intercessors on behalf of the other sisters and supplicate for the remission of their sins. In return for this, the other sisters serve the choir sisters materially by performing the more practical tasks. The choir sisters do have a privileged position in the community, but in return, they possess an almost sacramental role. The sisters whose primary task is ministry and not performing the divine offices are, however, not only audience members. Their roles with the performers overlap, and the author of the Typikon exhorts the nuns, I quote, to strive as if you saw God himself before your eyes. If you should be able to read, sing with both heart and mouth, honoring your master and creator and bridegroom with psalms and hymns and spiritual odes, end of quote. So the nun presents herself before God. The performance to God could also be seen as an actual sign of the substantial gap between him and humanity. Performative reading of liturgical texts also helps us to understand some of their functions in a better light. One of them is the scholar's attitude towards repetition, which, for example, resulted in the interest towards more creative hymnography, such as the Kontakia of Romanos the Melodist, that comparing with other genres of Byzantine hymnography have been overstudied, to be honest. Simultaneously, important researchers such as José Crostidier de Maton made hasty statements regarding the character of canon poetry. Canons are seen as meditative or contemplative as opposed to the entertaining or dramatic quality of the Kontakia. And moreover, Crostidier de Maton states, I quote, actually the preoccupations of the author of Kontakia have nothing in common with those of the author of canon. The latter is not preoccupied by teaching, proving, preaching, or convincing, but only by praying, end of quote. I don't understand this whole quote. What does it mean to pray but not to teach and preach at the same time? Echoes of this bold statement can be heard in scholarship also today. Recently, Father Andrew Louth noted that the dominance of canon poetry in later liturgical tradition, I quote him, may also be seen as a transition from poetry as proclamation to poetry as meditation, end of quote. But I must say that this meditative quality of the canons, which include a lot of repetition, is a misunderstanding, or at least an exaggeration, especially if we understand the word meditation as something passive, where the meditating person is a tabula rasa that only accepts meanings. Firstly, I challenge this meditative character of canons because of performance practices. Even though we do not possess much information on the exact way canons were performed during the first centuries of their existence, our living tradition, combined with the scarce historical evidence available to us, gives us some hints. What we know is that canons were performed by choir or choirs, as the text of canons were long and not always known by heart. Sometimes they were. In some cases, the canon was partly sung as a solo by the patriarch, abbot, or other high official. Canons as rare and long poems were primarily perceived through hearing and rarely read as a part of private devotion. So repetition and refrains were never just textual formulas that were transmitted in canons. When they were perceived orally, and therefore they become a form of communal participation. Here we come to a key issue in the use of repetition in canons, something that not only deals with refrains, but is generally characteristic of canons. Canons usually repeat the same themes over and over again. In this larger sense, repetition was not something the average churchgoer performed through his active participation, but moreover perceived. And this reminds us of John Chrysostom's commentary on the Psalms being an internal kind of church singing, taking place in the heart rather than in the vocal cords. But why is repetition necessary? In Byzantium, the use of repetition of both thematic content and textual formulas was an essential part of all liturgical life and arts. It was not perceived as some kind of passive floating in the space of meditation, but quite contrarily, as a tool for activating the believer's soul. Amy Papalexandrou suggests that the reason for repetition and formulaic expressions was to enhance the memory through sensual perception. In a Christian context, memory was seen as a synonym for understanding. And according to Papalexandrou, I quote her, "The Church played a vital role in providing mechanisms to remain vigilant in the fight against oblivion." End of quote. This fight was, in the liturgical space, conducted with the help of images, but I quote her again, "There are hints given at all levels that the average Byzantine also relied on oral processes and activities, on speaking and hearing as an essential means to perpetuate memory." End of quote. And indeed, the testament of Saint Lazarus of Mount Galesius, dating from 1053, describes how, I quote the document, "The illiterate, if they stand soberly and attend to what those in the choir are singing, even if they do not recognize everything they hear, yet all they do manage to grasp, they hold safe in their mind." End of quote. How is this possible without repetition of things that make their perceiver or performer participate of divine things? I mean, grasping these meanings from a text you might not even hear or understand well. You need a lot of repetition. This understanding of repetition makes us seriously reconsider the notions of literary style or creativity or such of the author. So, after this very lengthy theological consideration of text and performance, let me proceed to an application of this thinking in the question of the relation of a text with its author. As stated, we have recently seen substantial revisions of liturgical history based on quite recently discovered sources like the ancient Yadgari, the old Georgian hymnal, or the New Tropologion, the earliest Greek hymnal we have, and the earliest document to include full canons, the early Byzantine Orthodox hymnals, in other words. Sometimes we use the authorship of sermons in order to construct liturgical history. The notion of authorship in these two important liturgical genres, hymnography and sermons, requires a lot of nuancing, I think. These genres have often been dealt with as equally important sources, giving an equal weight to the attributions of both. Here there are two main problems. One is to become certain of the question of the authorship. It's not very easy in most cases. And the other is to understand what authorship in the particular liturgical genre actually means, and what is the relation between attributions to authors with prospography, in other words, the lives of these people. And here performative aspects come to our aid. Let us imagine the situation of preaching. In the world premiere of the sermon, so to say, it is clear who is preaching. The priest or bishop is standing in front of his audience. in the Byzantine time often communicating with his audience, as we can see from textual evidence. So people were applauding or commenting or criticizing or shouting during the sermon. So here the author certainly uses his personal authority. He's physically there to be seen by the congregation, and every word he utters is conceived as words authored by him. Even when he's quoting somebody, they are his words. The centrality of the person of the author continues even later on in the liturgical reading of the sermon, when the same sermons were transmitted in manuscripts to be read in the divine services, when the title of the sermon is recited together with the name of its author. This is always, even today in the Holy Mountain, when we read Byzantine sermons, in the liturgical offices, we say, sermon on the feast of the presentation of the Lord in the temple by our Father among the saints, Andrew of Crete, Father bless. So everybody knows who this is written by. However, even here, when we read posthumously sermons in liturgy, commonality takes place both in the spiritual composition of the sermon and also in the, I got a bit mixed up. So, commonality takes place both in the spiritual composition of the sermon, as we saw above when Gregory Palamas was exhorting his audience to pray, but also through the afterlife of the text, when sermons were edited by later copyists. So the creation of the text happens diachronically and communally. So even transmitting the text and the editorial process is creating the sermon to some extent. I remember the Panegyrikon, so the collection of these sermons to be read in liturgy of our own monastery, where we edit Byzantine sermons for our own liturgical needs, because nobody wants to stay in church for too long. So most often this editing process includes abbreviation. So we take away parts of the sermons. But even in this communally edited form of the sermon, the author's name indeed expresses authority. Nobody hears in the church that it's been abbreviated by me in my office. This might become a scholarly trap. In our quest after the authentic works of a preacher, we try to extract his true thinking and add him to a kind of pantheon of liturgical thinkers, a quest that includes dangers exactly because of the editorial afterlife of these texts. We cannot be sure that the text transmitted to us actually represents very faithfully the theology of the one who might have preached it for the first time. But what happens with hymns, which I'm more interested in? First of all, the cult of hymnographers is not particularly big. Whereas John Chrysostom is celebrated for his preaching, and John of Damascus likewise with his epithet chrysoroas, meaning the gold flowing, that was an epithet that was related to his preaching, hymnographers do not seem to receive a similar treatment in the Byzantine spiritual tradition. Romanos forms an exception with the narrative of his divine chanting inspiration during the Christmas vigil, when the Mother of God appeared to him in a dream and gave him a scroll and told him to eat it, and then he started singing with a beautiful voice and improvising hymns. Other hymnographers, such as John of Damascus and the brothers Grapti, are mainly celebrated for their perseverance in front of persecution. And in the case of John of Damascus, my patron said, his dogmatic and preaching activities. But they are not so much celebrated as hymnographers in the Byzantine spiritual tradition. There is a simple reason for this. Sermons are, at their world premiere, communicative actions between the person of the preacher and his audience. And in their afterlife, the texts are seen through the authority of the person these texts are attributed to. But even in the world premiere of a hymn, especially in choral performance, the hymnographer himself is invisible and, in some sense, inaudible. His name is not announced in the performance situation, and in the end, the audience does not even know who the hymnographer is, unless they are liturgical scholars who are interested in such matters. But the audience has no idea who this hymn is composed by, unless they see the text. Manuscript attributions were available only to few, and a big bulk of hymnography was anonymous anyway. And the earlier on we go in manuscript history, the less attributions we have. So even for early texts, attributions appear usually centuries after they started to be copied in liturgical sources. In the possible oral transmission of hymns to a codex, attribution becomes even more secondary. How do we even know if the singers were faithful to the written form of the hymn, since they often performed hymns by heart? And yet this fluidity is the very character of hymnography. It is dispersed in between of biblical readings, breaking down the divisions of the Bible, both through its content and structure. Hence the notion of rewritten Bible is often used in conjunction with Byzantine hymnography. So hymnography, in a weird way, is both temporal and timeless. It comes and goes, disappears, but is transmitted through tradition. This can also be seen from the way hymns are textually transmitted in manuscripts. Hymns attributed to Germanos of Constantinople, for example, have often a significantly varying number of stanzas in different manuscripts, which makes any kind of detection of a possible text impossible. As Alexandra Nikiforova has showed, Holy Saturday canons, for example, were combined, complemented, and edited in different manuscripts, and it is very problematic to discuss posteriorly what authorship was, since the original form of the canon is impossible to trace. The Georgian translation of Andrew of Crete's Great Canon by Evktim Tatsmindeli, compared to the Greek text, has tens of additional stanzas, probably composed by Evktime himself. For Evktime's audience, however, this double authorship is of course not audible. Again, these texts existed and were perceived only by particular communities in a particular occasion. If authorship of hymnography is seen as such a fluid phenomenon, it is not surprising why in early hymnographic manuscripts there are very few attributions. And as I said, they seem to become more when approaching the printed books, in which they are quite superfluous, however, with very dubious origins. The attributions are also quite varying and inconsistent, with the partial exceptions of canons, where, especially if there is an acrostic. But an acrostic can also be a sign of dedication and does not automatically refer to the author. So if the acrostic says Joseph, it might also be dedicated to Joseph, or somebody wants to imitate Joseph the hymnographer. So it's also a risky argument to have. And actually there's a Kontakion that has an acrostic Romanos, and there's clear evidence, as Derek Kruger showed, that this was actually a poem dedicated to somebody called Romanos, and not written by somebody called Romanos. Also, the forms attributions, the attributions, both in hymnographic manuscripts and in liturgical typica, are very minimal. John the monk, Cosmas the monk, it does not say John of Damascus or Cosmas of Mayuma. It says John the monk. So there's no extensive epithets that would explicitly connect them with a certain historical person either. It's an assumption that John the monk is John of Damascus. Even in the later liturgical tradition, there is no obsession of connecting the attributions with prospography, with particular historical persons. In a late addition to the Typikon of Marsaba, there is a passage I quote: "If in the Mineon, the monthly book of hymns, at the commemoration of some saint, there are canons of different hymnographers, one should prefer the canon of Kyr Cosmas, Mr. Cosmas." It doesn't say Cosmas of Mayuma, even though this is quite a late source. If there is a canon of Kyr John, so Sir John, and of other hymnographers, prefer John's. If of Kyr Theophanis and of others, that of Kyr Theophanis is preferred, for he is to be preferred before the others. If there is a canon of Joseph, but it doesn't say who Joseph, he's preferred before the other poets. If no canon exists by these, the canons of John are preferred. If his canons do not subsist, those of Theophanes are preferred. Of all these, those of Joseph are preferred before all the others. But anyway, you see this complicated discussion about which author is more important than the other, but they never ever specify who is this John, who is this Mr. John, who is this Mr. Cosmas, who is this Mr. Theophanes. The criterion does not seem to be related here of the hierarchy between the hymnographers. It does not seem to be related to the person of the hymnographer himself, but apparently the supposed chronology of the authorship of the hymn. It is notable that no explicit references here, as I said, to the identities of hymnographers are made. So I mentioned the problems of connecting attributions to prospography. Some years ago, in a forthcoming paper I wrote on the so-called Sabbath hymnographers, I made a debunking conclusion: there is no school of Sabbath hymnographers, or a school of poetic theological hymnography, even though some claim so. And with some certainty, we only know one hymnographer of Mar Saba monastery from the first millennium. So let us take the example of John of Damascus, my patron saint, who is told to be the author of a great number of hymns, usually identified with the attribution John the Monk. Unfortunately, even though he is my patron saint and I have daily communication with him, he has not revealed to me the truth regarding attributions of hymns to him. But maybe he did this in order to provide me a monthly salary as an academic scholar to try to find out this question. But anyway, in the Tropologion, there is nowhere an attribution to John of Damascus, but to John the Monk. Actually, the attributions to John of Damascus appear in the Georgian and Syriac translations of the Tropologion. But even there, the most famous poem of John is the so-called Easter canon, or Paschal canon, the day of resurrection. But in the Georgian and the Syriac Tropologia that have elsewhere the attribution John of Damascus, the Easter canon is not attributed to him. It's anonymous. So it is still an open question how much of these hymns, if any of the hymns that are attributed to John the Monk, actually belong to the same author. But also John is not the most uncommon name of monks in Byzantium. So I think actually there might be a confusion between a poet called John and the person of John of Damascus. And so it is very problematic to claim that this John the Monk, there might be even several Johns who were monks and composed hymns. We don't know for sure if they had anything to do with John of Damascus. What puzzles me is that the explicit information on his identity we receive on his sermon on the fig tree in a manuscript. It carries the description of John the Damascene, presbyter of the Anastasis. So there's no mentioning of a monk. He was a monk, we know, from his biographical sources, but he's primarily seen as a presbyter. Also, the Chronicle of Theophanes calls him Chrysoroas, thanks to his preaching skills, but mentions nothing about composing hymns. So we have this big amount of texts, biographical texts in the early period that have no mentioning of him as a hymnographer. So why would he be called a presbyter and a gold-flowing preacher in imitation of Chrysostom, and on the other hand, in hymnographic manuscripts, plainly a monk? We do not possess much reliable biographical evidence of his life, and the tradition of him as a hymnographer actually begins only in the 10th century. He lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, most prominently in the Vita by John, Patriarch of Jerusalem. As scholars have convincingly argued, it is improbable that John would have been a monk of the Mar Saba monastery, even though many in scholarship so claim. So this Vita, written by John, is very much legendary in a way. It includes a narrative of his elder initially banning him from writing hymns and only then allowing him to use his talents. This tradition is actually first included in the life of the Melodists, which is an early source, not very early, but from the 10th century also. And actually this source was later on banned by the copyists. There is a margin in a manuscript, if I remember correctly, it's in Constantinople, where in the margin it says, do not read this text because it's full of lies about the life of John. So if it's even seen by the church as a dubious text, and that's kind of the root of all these traditions of John being a hymnographer, was he actually a hymnographer at all? John is often also attributed to be an important developer of Byzantine musical notation and theory, but this has no reliable support in historical musical sources. That's why we need to know a little bit about music as well, so you have to check the musical manuscripts. The musical treatise of Damascene, John the Damascene, dates actually only from the 14th century, and there are some musical melodies transmitted in manuscripts that are attributed to John of Damascus, but actually these compositions only appear in the 15th century. And in other manuscripts, they are attributed to a composer called Manuel Chrysafis. So what about approaching a hymnographer's works through stylistic criteria? There are so-called Yembic Cantons, which are very weird canon poems that are attributed in the earliest Greek tropologion to John the Monk. But in later tradition, there's also a name in some manuscripts, John the Archlas. And there were already Byzantine commentators of these hymns who speculated on the identity of the poet. Is Archlas the Damascene? Is Archlas somebody else? And Dimitrios Skrekas' discussion on the question of authorship in these Yembic hymns is excellent, but it also raises doubts concerning the stylistic difference between John's rather simple Greek in his other canons, if we assume these other canons composed by John the Monk would be composed by John of Damascus, and on the other hand, the complex and archaizing language in the Yembic canons. But I ask here again, kind of as the devil's advocate, why do we assume that hymnographers more than a millennium ago would have not done stylistic experiments that would result in very different poetic styles, or that the author would not have stylistic development during his career? We know from modern authors that people develop when they write books. So somebody, when he writes in his 20s, has completely different style from his late works when he's in his 60s. I think, therefore, that stylistic matters are very risky in determining authorship, also in the case of sermons, because of this editorial history of these texts that I described. So after this big mess that I just provided to you, let me articulate my main argument. We saw the Byzantine understanding of text and performance, and we saw how little achieving some kind of reconstructed old text actually would provide, and how little importance the notion of authorship carries, especially in hymnography. We have seen how vague the information on attributions is. We have seen how difficult connecting these attributions to Byzantine prospography is. In the light of all this, I see some recent reconsiderations of liturgical history very problematic. Stig Frøshoff, in his recent Numbers and Oaks article on the history of the Palestinian office in Constantinople, uses, for example, the person of Germanos and his hymnographic activities as one of his arguments. But it is highly problematic to connect any of the hymns attributed to a poem called Germanos with the person of Germanos I, Patriarch of Constantinople. And if the question of authorship of hymns is so vague, can we really draw conclusions regarding the history of the so-called ancient Yadgari? Because the dating is based on the assumption that the attributions are correct, and the dating of the new Tropologion based on the attributions that it includes to Sophronios, John the Monk, and Cosmas the Monk. Of course, I realize that different hymnographical periods, genres, authors, and even individual hymns have to be dealt with in different ways. There is no one recipe that we can use for everything. But I still think that the careful reconsideration of liturgical texts as being performed, and more precisely through the performative understanding of them who composed, transmitted, used, and heard them, and the deconstructing of earlier scholarly narratives based on assumptions that are not always justifiable in the spiritual and intellectual context in which liturgical texts were created and used, is of absolute importance in order to proceed with the study of liturgical texts, hymnography, and sermons in particular. So, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm open for discussion. Please.
Thanks very much for your talk. I really appreciated it. I'm wondering if you would offer a few comments on a parallel, if there is one, between this anonymity of the authorship in hymnography with something similar in iconography.
Yeah, that's actually also a good thing. One of the matters that I really didn't talk about is also the relations between different arts and also between different literary genres. For example, there's been a lot of argumentation for authorship comparing one author's sermons and hymns. But of course, I think that's kind of silly in a way. Because, of course, you can quote anybody's sermons. Why would you only quote your own sermons in your hymns? You can also take earlier authors. As we see in the Paschal Canon, it's a very rich quotation. It's rich in quotations from Gregory the Theologian's sermons, who lived 300, 400 years before that. So I think it's very dangerous to kind of assume that influences between these genres were that clear-cut. But of course, there were influences between the genres. And we know, of course, in iconography, one of the main questions we have in iconography is what it was influenced by. What were the literary sources they were basing on? And this is the question because, for example, iconography has a lot of apocryphal, what we nowadays call apocryphal elements. But we also don't know much about iconographers themselves. We don't know if they were educated people. Probably there were some kind of workers, simple workers in the Byzantine times. Maybe not artists, as we understand artists today. So it's very probable that actually they were mainly basing their knowledge on hymns they heard in the church, and to some extent to sermons. But the problem with sermons is that sermons were often, if we trust the written sources that we have, they were often delivered in very, very complex language. So probably only the rich and very well-educated understood it. Also, if we think about acoustic matters, I'm in a space this small and I use a microphone so that you hear. But if you go to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and the preacher is there in the front, even if he shouts, only a few rows in the front will hear what he's saying. So probably sermons were not a very popular means of transmitting anything to people. But hymns, they were more easily audible in the church, also because they were sung. There were many people singing in unison, so you could understand the words better. They were also in a simpler language than sermons. And we don't have any information that people would have protested against hymns in church. But they protested against sermons. So, which I kind of like. I miss those times when you could protest a sermon in church. But so the moment of the hymn was somehow more sacred. So people were at least trying to be quiet. So they were not intentionally shouting at the singers like, "Oh, you're so bad," etc. So they kind of respected hymns more. So I think it's assumed that iconographers took a lot of influence from hymnography. But there's kind of the same thing. Iconography is also anonymous. We don't possess a lot of knowledge on the people who painted icons or made mosaics. And in the same way, we don't possess a lot of information about singers, except these hymnographers that I'm now discussing. But even that is on very shaky ground. So there is this, the Byzantine society is very much based on anonymity, excluding sermons. Sermons have a more explicit way of expressing authorship, because it's that kind of genre. But all these liturgical prayers and liturgical songs, it's not of primary concern to the people. Who is this written by? They're interested, it's a lovely hymn, it makes me think, makes me pray, it makes me approach God better. That's what they cared about, and not authorship. But of course, we kind of have this obsession. We want to know the sources, we want to know everything. And then I think we're sometimes kind of asking the wrong questions from the sources when we approach them.
Thank you very much, Father. Absolutely fascinating. And I want to say that...
if you interject, so
oh, sorry. Yeah, I said absolutely fascinating. To thank you. If I may come back to the first part of your lecture, which I found particularly insightful. You introduced that by saying that you're an outsider. And I would suggest that you are in fact just the opposite of an outsider, and what you've done methodologically is demonstrated the importance of participatory knowledge, which is something that so often, in at least, I think, modern liturgical studies has been lost. In other words, I mean, I have no doubt that people who are actually performing this stuff on a daily basis, I want to ask you about the Greek, what you use as a Greek term for performance, okay? but anyway, we'll get back
Yeah.
to that. So anybody who's doing this on a daily basis with a community or smaller, whatever, on a daily basis, is going to have a form of knowledge that can be significantly different from that of someone sitting in a library. And by the way, it's not to deprecate, the other kind of knowledge. I think one of the things as I get older and older, in fact, I'm now retired, I go to conferences, I notice how you sometimes there are these battles that are going on because someone is trying to somehow almost take charge of the whole field with the particular kinds of insights or methods that he or she is using. And I think if we could just all agree, there's a division of labor. People are doing this, people are doing this. What I'm excited about is the fact that you're doing something that I have argued for years needs to be done much more often, and it's not done in the academy as often. Why? Because that is considered too pietistic, too devotional. But the person that comes to our aid here methodologically is none other than Hans-Georg Gadamer, Truth and Method, where he, an atheist, points out, well, he didn't believe in God, let's say, okay. So someone who's not a religious person says, there are things that you can only know from the inside by committing yourself to them, So what you've done here by saying, okay, what's going on as this singer sings, what kind of meaning is being, as it were, projected and communicated. I mean, that's absolutely fantastic, and I can only ask you to keep on doing that. I mean, I have a question about your approach to corporate participation. That's my
Corporate.
Only big reservation. But what's the Greek word that you would
Performance.
Translate performance into Greek?
Epitelesis. And actually, it's so in Greek. Usually, when we speak about performance studies nowadays, we say epitelestikotita.
Okay, epitelesis.
Yeah.
Yeah, but see, you understand.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this has to do with the connotations that the word performance has in certain circles. You realize that one would have to explain that epitelesis that you're using, because from my sense, and it translates into Slavonic as sovershenia, that does not at all convey this sense of a kind of extrinsic, I even wrote this down for myself, extrinsic detached behavior. Okay?
Yeah.
In other words, performance done by somebody on a stage is precisely what we don't want in liturgy, even though we want that quality, that level of expertise, technical brilliance, etc., concern for every detail. But we don't want someone who puts something on, an act, and then walks away and behaves in a completely different way.
Yeah.
So I think that in these articles that you've written, because you said you've published several.
Yeah.
And
actually, one of the things, So one of the things I discussed is also that the problem in performance theory is that it's very differently understood by different language groups.
Right.
So the language in which you write affects the understanding of the word very much. So, for example, in Finnish, in my native language, we translate performance theory into Finnish as performanssiteoria. So we use the English-based word performance, but in Finnish it has a highly specific meaning. So it's kind of these weird modern dancers coming to the city square and like throwing food on people and shouting. So that's a performance in Finnish. But it's not, but in English, it also, in everyday language, it's like, can you perform this action? So it has a very different, whereas in Greek, it's also a liturgical term. When we say in the apolysis, in the dismissal of the service, so for example, so we can say this the Mother of God, istin synaxin epitelumen, whose synaxis we perform. So it's also a liturgical term.
Let's see, perform, but wouldn't you say accomplish in the sense of bringing it to a kind of fulfillment, the telos? And that's so different from the average, because I think the reason that you're going to end up with confusion in an English audience, well, actually in many audiences, is simply because there's a way in which liturgy, let's face it, I used to travel a lot in the former Soviet you want to see liturgy done as a performance, you know, where there's the paid singer, and in Petersburg I actually saw, you know, a 50-voice choir where they're actually facing the people during the divine liturgy and singing this, and so are they what is the nature of their performance if they're being paid, you know, to show up in tuxedos and
Yeah.
so that's where you're going to get the
Yeah,
concern.
I'll come back to you in a moment. I just want to add something to this. It's very different to understand that, like in the Byzantine liturgical understanding, as I understand it, they are performing to people too. They put on performance clothing, but the key is in what you said. It's not something that they only do for the liturgy, and they don't fake. This is the important thing. So the priest actually, when he puts his vestments on, he is Christ. He's not faking to be Christ, he is Christ. And this is the whole, so the Byzantine understanding of mimesis, it's not some kind of fake imitation, it's participatory imitation. So I actually truly participate of the person I am performing in the liturgy. And I think this is the whole key of the thing. You had something to say.
Well, Father, thank you very much for this insightful and very compelling lecture, irreverent and orthodox, obviously. I do have a question. It's just some observations. I'm on the fringe because I don't work on Byzantine liturgy. I am interested and touching upon Coptic liturgy. And it's exactly what you raised, the
If I may, I would like to ask if there are other questions. This is more like a discussion and dialogue after.
Okay.
After, I apologize for interrupting.
No, I'm sorry.
But other questions?
Could you specify what you mean by saying the manuscript is not a part of the performance during the liturgical celebration? So I'm thinking of, I know it's a different genre, but for example, the gospel is read from a gospel book. So would you also say the gospel book is not a part of the performance of the liturgy, or is it just a different genre?
You have to be very careful with words. The manuscript is not the performance. Manuscript is not liturgy. But liturgy is a performance always. And it might be based on a manuscript. But if we think about practicalities, gospel manuscripts were used by the priest or the deacon during the service. We know that they read from books. But this is not the case with hymnography, actually, in many cases. Hymnographic manuscripts were not used by singers in worship very much. So in the Byzantine tradition, we have the canonarch, who, at least according to written sources, he was the one who had the book, and he was reciting the verses to the singers. We even keep this tradition in the Holy Mountain even today, even though we have books, even the singers have books. But we still have this tradition of a guy who's running between two choirs, and so he's reciting all the texts before we sing them. So he was kind of the whisperer of the liturgy. So he was running around and telling people, you have to sing this, you have to sing this, like the master of ceremony. But also most of the hymns, and especially the fixed repertoire that you would sing in a service, was sung by heart, and it still today is sung by heart. And we know, even from musical manuscripts, we know that they didn't really use them in worship. They were school books or museum books. So they wanted to preserve these melodies in a written form, but there's not a lot of signs of active use in liturgy. And that's why in the Byzantine musical tradition, they created this system of, like in the Western tradition, they had the system of chironomies, so hand gestures, which were melodic hand gestures, not rhythmical. So the choir master remembered the melody very well by heart, and he was transmitting it to the singers with his hand gestures, so they knew what to sing. So in this sense, manuscript was not even in many cases used in the performance. With Gospels, we know that it was used, but it's also because the object itself was a sacramental object. But hymnographic manuscripts never were. You never go to a Greek church to kiss a mineon or an oktoichos, but you go to kiss a gospel book. So there's a very important division between these things. And even today, like if you go to a Greek church, we know, for example, we read always the Gospel of the Mother of God every day in Mount Athos. We all know it by heart, but still we always have the text for it. But for the hymns that we know by heart, we never use texts. So there's kind of this hierarchy between texts used in liturgy as well that we have to keep in mind. Therefore, we see that, for example, Gospel manuscripts have quite small differences between each other. But when we go to hymnographic material, the differences are huge between manuscripts, especially because it was not a liturgical object in itself. It was just a means to preserve this repertoire in a written form, and still the liturgy itself was mainly an oral practice for the singers.
Scholarship, and I don't want to downgrade the scholarship in any way, but I wonder if I understood you right, there was a lot of anonymity in the writings and certainly iconography. Is there some wisdom in that through the Orthodox Church from the fathers to keep the ego out and to keep humility? Doesn't matter who really said it or did it. It's important that it's inspired.
This is an explanation that is often given today, but I think it's a bit surprising that Byzantines themselves, as far as I can recollect, don't really discuss this matter. And I think that their assumption was that things are anonymous in some sense. And many of these attributions, as we can see, for example, in the case of liturgies, John Chrysostom, Saint Basil, etc., they were not written by these people, but it was a mean of respecting them and honoring them posthumously. So this is kind of the way the Byzantines understood authorship. And of course, the ideal in Christian life was not to promote yourself as an author, as an artist, as a poet, whatever. But there were exceptions too, of course. So you can. It's difficult to say anything too general about it.